This is ultimately a problem of evil. It's a human problem more than an ideological or political problem, motivated more by deep problems of the human soul. We don't have a conversation in America that really allows for such philosophical consideration.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. The only proper response to the latest mass shooting in the United States is horror and outrage. The suspect, an 18-year-old named Peyton Gendron, murdered 10 African Americans in the parking lot of a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. His motive for committing this atrocity was apparently indicated in social media postings in which he vented his neo-Nazi, racist, and anti-Semitic beliefs. This particular strain of white supremacist thinking may be limited to a tiny fraction of the population. But as we've seen in previous horrors, like the synagogue shootings in Pittsburgh in 2018 and Poway, California in 2019, its adherents are violent and capable of putting their twisted ideas into action. There are many opinions about what to do about this problem, but few are practical. In a country where there are more firearms than people and the right to own one is guaranteed by the Constitution, almost all gun control proposals merely nibble around the edges of the issue and would do nothing to stop mass killings. Combine that with society's ongoing failure to address mental illness in a serious manner, or even to talk about the prevalence of evil or what we do about pure evil in our society, and a steady stream of such terrible events is almost a given. But that doesn't stop the posturing of the political class whenever gun violence produces a sufficiently gruesome toll of lives to allow them to use the latest atrocity to ride their favorite political hobby horses. And as has happened in the past, neo-Nazi and/or radical right-wing violence is seized upon by the political left to justify their critique of those who disagree with them on a host of issues. That meant a news cycle of cable news commentary, social media postings, and political statements that attempted to link Republicans and conservatives to the slayings in Buffalo. Not only is America plagued by a gun violence dilemma, it is also trapped in a hyper-partisan political culture that is essentially breaking society. It is one thing to say that those who disagree with administration actions that amount to opening the borders are wrong, or that their worries about the changes such policies will have on the nation are without substance. It is quite another to say that those who think this way, a category that easily includes at least half the country, can be linked to lunatics who post bizarre neo-Nazi rants on social media and then fire into crowds of human beings. If that sort of effort to link mainstream opinion on a variety of issues is described as enabling white supremacy, or goes mainstream and becomes normative political discourse, that's a disaster. It means we are approaching a moment of no return with respect to efforts to bridge the partisan gap and to rebuild not just bipartisanship, but a sense of shared community. And when those involved in this dangerous effort to delegitimize political discourse also claim to be doing so in the name of defending Jews from neo-Nazis, then we are in dangerous territory indeed. Not the least because some of those on the left who make such accusations are themselves guilty of support for anti-Semitic ideas and efforts to delegitimize the Jewish state and all who support it. Some of the most egregious examples of this kind of thinking included an article in Rolling Stone in which the author linked the killer with a laundry list of mainstream conservative thinkers and causes on a variety of political social issues. Equally contemptible was a predictable collection of stories churned out by The Atlantic. In one, readers were informed by a former Obama administration figure that even if the shooter appears to have acted on his own, he wasn't really a lone wolf, because conservative political and media figures shared his beliefs, even if they do so in a manner that gives them plausible deniability. A lot of this revolves around discussion about replacement theory. That's the idea that those who enable mass illegal immigration are essentially trying to create a new electorate that they believe, rightly or wrongly, will ensure that Democrats will stay in power for the indefinite future. It was cited by the Buffalo shooter. That gave leftist ideologues and even politicians like Representative Liz Cheney, who was at war with her own Republican Party and eager to brand the overwhelming majority of GOP voters and office holders who support former President Donald Trump, as supporters of white supremacy, an excuse to connect dots between her political opponents and this crime. This accusation has been taken up again by the Anti-Defamation League in an effort to discredit Republicans. It's part of their switch from their former nonpartisan stance to becoming a mouthpiece for Democratic Party talking points. The problem with this effort is that it ignores the fact that Democrats, liberals, and yes, even the Atlantic, often say the same thing about the changing demography of the American electorate. The only difference being that unlike those on the right who decry the possibility, they are looking forward to a more Hispanic electorate, ensuring what they think is perpetual defeat for the GOP. How can it be perfectly legitimate to cheer the idea that states like Texas will flip from red to blue because of immigration? An assumption, I might add, that is not panning out due to the fact that Hispanic voters are just as alarmed by open border policies as non-Hispanics. But if those who worry about the impact of the same trend are racist and even giving a green light for mass murder, how does that square with it? What's also wrong with this effort to associate the right with extremist shooters is that those who speak this way are predictably silent when it comes to murders that can't somehow be linked to the political right. It's not a case of whataboutism to note that the anti-white racism of the person who deliberately drove a car into a Christmas parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin, murdering 6 people last year, did not set off a round of soul-searching on the left about the way the Black Lives Matter movement and the influence of critical race theory is fueling that sort of violence, or the riots that burned American cities in the summer of 2020. Nor is it out of bounds to point out that the epidemic of gang shootings that has resulted in hundreds of murders of African American victims in the city of Chicago alone last year is ignored by the same voices that seek to exploit the far smaller, though terribly tragic toll of white extremist shootings in an effort to delegitimize conservative opinion. The ADL is belatedly recognizing the danger of anti-Semitism emanating from the left, but it refuses to connect any dots between the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that critical race theory and intersectionality give a permission slip to anti-Semitism. In this way, they have helped create a narrative on the political left in which those who wish to demonize the right can invoke a fear of anti-Semitism while not being held accountable for their own ideas that are actually anti-Semitic, or about major figures like the new White House press secretary, who are credibly linked to anti-Semitism. This does nothing to help us deal with mass murders, racism, or anti-Semitism. The victims in Buffalo deserve to be mourned and honored. The same is true with all others who have been slain by hate-filled murderers, no matter what ideology that has been used to justify their crimes. Democracy can't work if you treat political opponents as not just wrong, but evil. That's something that the willingness of liberal echo chamber media outlets and their political allies to use such events to make political hay don't seem to care about. The sprint to place events like the Buffalo shooting in a political context isn't just counterproductive. It is demonstrably making political discourse more toxic and divisive, and creating an environment where anti-Semitism is more likely to thrive than fail. If our civic culture seems broken, point to attitudes like these as the cause, far more than the rants or even the actions of extremists. And now to our interview of the week. How does a democracy thrive in an atmosphere of total political war? Americans have learned in recent years just how irresponsible a task it is to maintain a common political culture in the current hyper-partisan atmosphere, in which opponents are deemed not just wrong, but evil, and not just supporting bad policies, but allies of extremist lunatics who are responsible for mass shootings like the recent atrocity in Buffalo. The toxic impact of the culture wars has long been apparent, but we're only just now beginning to see what happens when many in both political parties believe that elections were stolen, as was the case with Democrats in 2016 and Republicans in 2020, or that their opponent's purpose is the destruction of the nation and democracy. Making sense of a political landscape in which there's nothing in the middle of the road but roadkill, and in which a belief in a common goal or shared values evaporates, isn't easy. We're fortunate, therefore, to have with us today one of the brightest and most creative minds in reporting and thinking about contemporary politics. Ben Domenech is a Fox News contributor and the host of the Ben Domenech podcast. He co-founded The Federalist and served as publisher for nearly a decade. He also co-founded the conservative group blog Red State. He's a former speechwriter for Health and Human Services Secretary Tommy Thompson and Senator John Cornyn of Texas. He also served as a fellow in the Manhattan Institute and senior fellow at the Heartland Institute, and has been published in a host of major outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Politico, National Review, Commentary, Reason, and the New York Post. Ben Domenech, welcome to Top Story.
It's great to be with you, Jonathan. And after some initial technical hiccups, I hope that we have time to have a great conversation.
I'm sure we will. And thank you for taking the time to do it. I really appreciate it. Ben, I want to start with what I guess is the top story this week, and that was the awful atrocity in Buffalo, the mass shooting at a supermarket and the murder of so many people. And this time, unlike perhaps some of these atrocities in the past, there was no grace period after the news broke. It was almost immediately jumped on by some of our friends on the left to blame the actions of this neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, racist on political conservatives, basically everybody who disagrees with them about every single issue. It raises some important questions. Basically, how can we all live in the same country if we're willing to believe that our political opponents are not merely wrong, but accessories to evil, accessories to murder, to mass murder? Where does that leave us as, in terms of our political system? Where does it leave us in terms of our society?
Well, Jonathan, I think that the big thing that we have to recognize here is that this is ultimately a problem of evil. It's a human problem more than an ideological or political problem, motivated more by deep problems of the human soul as opposed to the temporary ideologies or political movements or the like. Unfortunately, we don't have a conversation in America that really allows for such philosophical consideration. And I think that, when it comes to the jump to conclusions that we see take place, it really does take on a new rapid nature in the era of social media, where people can immediately comb through and see everything that someone has been saying, or the views that they've been sharing, um, in all manner of ways. I've done it myself. I've fallen into that trap of doing the research and diving into the Reddit threads and the like. And I think that there's sort of a deep mental frailty to the American condition. Part of it motivated by the pandemic, but overall, I would say it's this feeling of social isolation that I think has taken on a number of different elements within our society. You see it within the rise in opioid deaths. You see it within overdoses. You see it within the way that people just have this gnawing feeling about them of apocalypse, and whether that's motivated by their feelings regarding immigration or political movements, or whether it's motivated, I think, by that deeper human condition. It's something that is unfortunately not something that Americans deal well with these days. we paper over it, we cover it up, we pretend to look the other way, or we pretend like our policies are helping. And I think you can see it everywhere from the streets of meth addicts in San Francisco to the the shooter who obviously targeted Asian massage parlors and the like. In some ways they all come from the same place, and that's a feeling of isolation that I think America these days just doesn't really deal well with.
Yeah, I think that really does go straight to the heart of this problem of of mental illness, and as you say, of isolation, and that has deepened, that has maybe helped facilitate even more of these crimes. I think that's certainly true, but it's also true that the last several years, it seems as if our political system is broken. Um, you know, um, that the reaction to the election of Donald Trump, to the administration of Donald Trump, to the post presidency of Donald Trump is such that it has sort of, it's not merely Trump derangement syndrome. It's a belief, and really an inability on the part of, sort of opinion leaders on the left to differentiate between sort of mass murderers and a populist movement that, say, is skeptical of illegal, about illegal immigration, skeptical of the Washington establishment, and it sort of paints with a very broad brush. And it even, it's sort of the never Trump version. I think the most egregious response to Buffalo, to me, was not so much sort of for example, an article in the Rolling Stone, which sort of listed every political issue on the right as somehow being linked to this murder, but it was Liz Cheney, who is on many issues still a conservative, but she still believes that Trump, the Republican leadership, is enabling white supremacy by taking specific stands or just opposing her. Sort of what do we make of that, and how do we get back from that?
Well, I mean, a big part of what you're talking about there is this whole creep of defining fairly standard conservative opinions about things under a rubric of white supremacy or white nationalism, which, from my perspective, does the side of the people who are making that argument no favors, because what it does is it drives. If everyone's a white nationalist, then nobody's a white nationalist. If it's a white nationalist position, for instance, to be concerned about the southern border and to see the flow of migrants coming across as something that is a major security issue, one of social instability, one that enables and empowers the Mexican cartels. If that's a white nationalist position, then you've driven a whole slew of just typical conservatives, border hawks, including many Hispanic voters in the valley who share those
Mhm.
same opinions,
Right.
into the arms of a radical ideology. And if they start to operate under the mindset that they are a radical ideology, then it erases the power of, which I think is important, of distinguishing between um, the people who truck in irresponsible, replacement theories and that kind of thing, with people who simply want to have a border that works for the country, and that is something that we can actually manage, control, and defend. And look, I think it's really, I saw obviously the epic length New York Times reporting uh, about Tucker Carlson, and they lumped a bunch of things into conspiratorial categories, including the idea that there was a global elite that looks down at, at working class people.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like, okay, wait a minute, that's something that conservatives have been on about and talking about for forever. I mean,
That's something
Nixon
a
and
lot of
Reagan.
liberals believe too. I mean,
Yes,
ordinary
yes,
working class
absolutely,
Democrats,
totally.
ordinary
You know,
Americans all think that, don't we?
yes, yes. I mean, of course. I mean, that look, I think that this is a situation where we need to learn to live together as a country, and we need to be able to respect each other even as we fight and argue and disagree. And a big part of that, I think, is being able to have confidence in the decisions that are being made when it comes to elections. If you have a situation where a significant number of people on the left after 2016, on the right after 2020, don't have faith in the outcome of the election, whether they believe it was hacked or stolen by the Russians, or whether they believe that the election outcomes were finagled with in certain respects, then you end up in a situation where you can't function as a representative democratic republic, because you are not going to be able to have confidence that when you lost, that it wasn't just something that, that there was media bias or all these other normal issues at play, but actually that something untoward was going on, something, potentially illegal and certainly unethical. And we need to get back to the point where we can have confidence in that, because otherwise we're not going to be able to work together as a country.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I wrote a piece for the Federalist a couple of months ago, I think, where it seemed to me I was citing all the evidence that sort of liberals and some Democrats were already preparing to spin the 2024 election as having been stolen, even though we're 2 years away from it. Will we ever have another election that everybody agrees on the outcome, no matter what the margin, no matter who the candidates are? And I'm beginning to worry. It also, I think you made also a very good point about how the sort of the demonizing of mainstream opinion does no favors to the battle against extremism. And sort of one example of this that is part of our brief here at JNS is the way the ADL immediately jumped, the Anti-Defamation League, that is, immediately jumped on the Buffalo shooting and started taking shots at Elise Stefanik, a not terribly right-wing Republican congressman from upstate New York, because of her, stand against illegal immigration, and sort of saying that she was enabling, sort of white supremacy too, and that this was somehow enabling anti-Semitism. Well, again, if everything is anti-Semitism, if mainstream political opinion in this country is anti-Semitic, then how can we ever differentiate, actual anti-Semitism, which exists? And, I might add, we have a new White House press secretary who's dabbled in it herself. And yet, we're supposed to turn a blind eye to that and just say it's okay.
I think that one of the things that we deal with is these organizations who profit from really, putting themselves in these positions of being the arbitrators of what is acceptable speech and what is not.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, we used to have a left-right balance on this that included the ACLU and organizations like that were willing to defend people's speech.
Mm-hmm.
And now, unfortunately, they've really crumbled. They've gotten to a point where, as uh, left of center writer Laura Bazelon was saying on the Fifth Column the other day, this is really an organization that no longer fulfills its function in terms of defending American civil liberties, and that's something that we really miss. I think we need more of that, and it's one of the reasons why the handful of cultural voices that are willing to make that case are all the more important. And a lot of them are people who basically occupy the same position that they did back in 1998,
Mm-hmm.
but the political dynamics have flipped. So just being anti-woke, just being skeptical of the identitarian agenda of the left today is enough to make people like Bill Maher, folks who are on the outs. And that's something that I think is pretty amazing to behold.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting because, of course, I don't agree with a lot of what Bill Maher believes. He would certainly disagree with a lot of what I believe, and I'm sure what you think
Hmm.
about political issues. And yet he seems to be on the same side as us when it comes to, free discourse, the idea of free speech, and against this move to basically cancel everybody who is not, singing from the woke choir book. And, it sort of kind of scrambles our political, our whole political system right now, because the deck has been reshuffled to some extent, based on these issues. And, I look to the way, ideas like intersectionality and critical race theory, which is a thing, contrary to what some of our friends on the left, try to gaslight us about, how that is, sort of infiltrated into, sort of our political discourse. And, that's the real issue. I mean, how do we think about America? What do we think about this country? Is it basically good? Do we believe in our history? Do we believe, for all of our flaws, that this is still a good society that has something to offer the rest of the world? And if we don't, if the 1619 project is actually the way Americans think about their country, you know, good luck with anything in terms of not merely, bipartisanship, but sort of how we can go forward, how we can all live together.
Mhm. Douglas Murray's book, The War on the West, which has gotten a lot of attention in the last month or so, obviously is seeing from this perspective. But I also was interested to see the statement put out by National Review the other day, signed by a pretty wide variety of people, concerning sort of a defense of the American project. The statement was interesting in part to me because of what it didn't say. I think I would have gone a lot further. But one aspect that it did nod toward was this idea which has emerged, on the right, but I think it's actually not just defined by the right. I think a lot of it includes, a number of Christians and a number of people who are concerned about kind of cultural blight. That America has become, and the West has become decadent. That the liberal, small L, values of the Enlightenment, are no longer the path that we ought to take. That, say what you will about, the Chinese Communist Party, but they don't have trans working hour, that kind of thing. Um, and to which, of course, I respond, well, they do have genocide.
Yeah.
but but one of the things that I think is a very sad development, and one that I think that we need to really avoid, is falling prey to a an argument that is similar to the 1619 argument, but comes from a different place. That basically says that that while the 1619 project is wrong about the nature of the American founding, that the American founding was still something that has been corrupted, or that was very corruptible because of its Enlightenment values, and that it's just taken us a while to get to this point where we just have this cultural rot, or something like that. I am not in favor of that. I just don't believe it. I think that it's wrong, and I think that it misunderstands, uh, how it misunderstands so many fundamental things that I think are good about this country and its people, and that are worth defending against a leftist regime that is willing to do anything, I think, to take the heights of power and then crush their enemies. And that's something that I think is, has to be guarded against, and the intentions of the people, many of whom I like, who go down that path toward, decrying the decadence of the West, or implying that it's something that we can't get out of, that it doesn't, that we don't also have the seeds, for finding a path through this, thanks to the Enlightenment values that, were adopted here. I think that's very short-sighted.
Yeah, I totally agree. And obviously, I think we're talking about our mutual friend Saurabh Amari to some extent, and some of his writings, and others. But, and I think, Saurabh makes an excellent point about how, at a time when so many bad things are coming into the public square, that we have to sort of defend the good. We can't be, entirely neutral about it and just expect that, the bad won't drive out the good. I think that there's a fair point there. But I think the idea that we must therefore trash classical liberal values, as you say, the values of the Enlightenment upon which this country was founded, takes us into, I think, a very dark place. And I think of myself, you're a parent now, I'm a parent. And when I was trying to teach my daughter sort of about what it means to be a political conservative as opposed to being a political liberal, um, my point was that I was trying to tell her that, yes, I'm a conservative, but that means I'm kind of a 19th century liberal. That classical liberalism, defending the rights of the individual, defending the ability of citizens to go through life unburdened by the government and not oppressed by it. That, yes, that's what we call conservatism in the 21st century, but it's a basically liberal value, and that's what we're standing up for. And if we lose that sense that we don't actually believe in classical liberalism, then I don't think we're actually defending the American system. We're not defending American democracy against, as you say, the 1619 project.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the things that we I think are entirely right, of course, but I think one of the things that we need to rediscover is the importance of making the argument and continuing to make the argument, even after you think that the argument is won or settled. I think there were a lot of people in the 90s, in particular, who thought that this argument's basically over. That we don't have to continue to make these
Yeah,
arguments.
history was over.
History
Alas,
was
not.
over. It lasts not. But one of the things that I think of that happened in my life, in the political sort of tenure, is that I think a lot of people who believed in free trade felt that free trade was something they didn't really need to make the argument for anymore, as a value, because everyone believed in it. And then they were surprised to wake up one morning and realize that not everyone believed in it. And in fact, there were a lot of people who were very skeptical about its outcomes, were skeptical about what it's done to the country. And it turned out that you needed to keep making these arguments. And so I think of that as being a similar case when it comes to those Enlightenment classical liberal values that you're talking about.
Right. That leads me to ask, sort of broaden from sort of our domestic, battles to how we view the world. Right now, I mean, for many of us, I mean, Ukraine has been the number one story for the last 3 months, for understandable reasons. It's a shooting war. There's been terrible atrocities, terrible suffering. It's also become sort of the main focus of American foreign policy. And I think that too has sort of divided conservatives in very interesting ways. On the one hand, you have people like, John Podhoretz, who came on our show here and was talking about how neoconservatism was vindicated by the idea that, well, it's a dangerous world. And if we grow weak, bad things happened. And that's a strong argument that American weakness, the Biden administration's weakness in Afghanistan and elsewhere, helped set the stage for Ukraine. On the other hand, now we have many conservatives who are just saying, who cares? Or who are so turned off or so polarized, maybe because they think that so much of the sympathy of Ukraine is somehow linked to the battle against Donald Trump and the whole first impeachment drama. That that there's this sort of anti-war movement on the right, kind of again scrambles our political eggs, and it's hard to know where we think of it. And I've been thinking about like where your late father-in-law, Senator John McCain, what would he be telling us now about this sort of problem? He was certainly, early to understand, even when George W. Bush didn't, that Vladimir Putin was evil and a KGB agent, whatever whatever else people were trying to superimpose on him. At the same time, I have to say that some people on the right who were skeptical about our, sort of our tunnel vision about Ukraine are not wrong to worry about whether we're sort of overemphasizing that. Where do you come down on this?
Well, a couple of thoughts. First off, I certainly would not speak for my late father-in-law
Of
because
course,
he,
I didn't mean to
has
didn't mean to say that
his
you
own.
could,
No,
but
no, 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 no. I'm always very reluctant to invoke him because I think he and I probably would have disagreed, or we would have had. I wish he was around, if only because we would have some great arguments.
mhm, sure.
But one of the things that I think is true in this moment is any illusions that existed on the right about the possibility of having a collaborative or closer relationship with a Putin led Russia, I think has been swept away by this war and should. And look, if it was going to happen, it would have happened.
Mhm.
This is not a situation where the possibility was not there. You could sort of squint and see it, but he has been an
Yeah, I should
expansionist.
add, it's not as if the left didn't try it too. Both
Oh no,
Obama and Biden
absolutely.
tried
The
this.
reset, everything. I mean, everybody tried this, and it wasn't going to work, and it wasn't going to work for a number of reasons. But a big part of it is that he is an expansionist. He wants to restore the borders of what was lost. And look, I encourage people to read more about Putin, to read, a number of the different articles and books that have been written that really go into his formative years and the ways that he views the world. And I think that they would gain more of an understanding. But we also have to recognize, and I think that Bridge Colby is right about this, that America's military is not really is not built to handle the kind of two-front war that has been talked about in the past, and that our priority in terms of the long term has to be the challenge of a rising China and especially
Mhm.
as it relates to Taiwan. But from my perspective, Ukraine very much is a test case, or has been should be understood as a test case for what the Chinese would engage in if they did take Taiwan. And I think that obviously it's different circumstances, but one of the big things that I think we've learned is hardening the target earlier is a
Mhm.
very important. Giving the resources that are necessary in order to handle what this type of situation would look like in actual practice is important, and also the willingness of our friends in these nation states to fight for themselves is very important.
Mhm.
The so much of I think the American reaction to Ukraine, which has been so surprising in some ways in terms of um, how much it is in a time of great differences of opinion, how much it is united in terms of the vast majority of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, all viewing Putin as being evil and a bad actor, and having enormous respect for the response of President Zelensky. What we should take away from that, I think, is that Americans really like to see people who are willing to stand up and fight for themselves, and that's courage that they respond to naturally. Look, it turns out Ukraine can be a place that deals with a lot of corruption, that deals with a lot of untoward and bad actors internally, obviously that prevented them from joining NATO in the past, and yet
Mhm.
have enormous national pride
Right.
and be willing to fight for themselves. I I joked to I have a friend, a longtime friend, who is Cajun, and I sent him one of the early on videos of Ukrainians joyriding on Russian tanks, and I said, I feel like they invaded Louisiana. It's and there is a bit of that. But one thing that I do think that we can come away from this with is the NATO alliance is now stronger than it has been in a very long time. And to finally get and this is something that I think we need to absolutely enforce, to finally get the level of security payments out of these nations that needed to be doing it a lot earlier, I think is key. And look, I think that this is going to reorient a lot of different things long term. One thing that I do think is interesting, just in terms of recent developments, is seeing the way. that the French in particular are talking about providing an off ramp, because I don't think they're saying that in a vacuum. I think they're saying that having conversations with the Russians and recognizing kind of what's going on, and it is a very real possibility that their military situation is perhaps much worse than even what's been reported. So look, it's an astounding conflict for a lot of different reasons. I think that a lot of people on the right never believed that Vladimir Putin would do this for
Hmm.
all of the strategic risk involved. But I think that a big part of why he did is that he really does believe in reforming those borders along the lines of what was once there. And if you're a true believer in that, then you're willing to take on a lot of risk, even if he did so under circumstances or perhaps with information that was not being informed, in which he was not being informed accurately. But look, it's an astounding situation. I think it has reoriented a lot of the different foreign policy debates on the right. I think it will continue to do so. But I hope that as we look at this, we keep in mind that we can't be flippant about the way that the world works,
Hmm.
and sort of along the lines of what we were saying about Enlightenment liberalism, you you can't fall into the trap of believing that just because things have been a certain way for a long time, that they're going to remain that way. And that's something that I think a lot of people on the foreign policy side have made that mistake. And you know the just and I know this is a long-winded answer. Just to circle back to what JPod said, John Podort said about the vindication of neoconservatism. I don't think that's the case. I think it's way too early to say that.
Hmm.
I do think it will receive greater consideration, but I do think that one of the lessons that this rising generation of politicians has taken from the incompetence of the Biden administration in Afghanistan and from 20 years of really not achieving what we wanted to in Afghanistan or Iraq, certainly not achieving the goals that we went in there with necessarily. I think that they're going to have to come to a new medium, a new sort of steady point where we say, look, we like the world to be a place where America is in charge, and we don't want someone else to be in charge. So what will that take? I think it will take a military, particularly a navy that is really reinvested in, um, and and I think it's going to take a lot of tough choices about the way that we approach the world. Um, but I think look, if we've taken the lesson away that we can't go down these perhaps utopian paths in terms of trying to spread democracy or help Afghanistan women learn to drive, then I think that instead, we have to take a really hard look at what maintaining order, maintaining a world that the Chinese don't run is going to demand of us. And that's probably it's going to be a lot, but it's going to be, I think, some it's going to require some real clear-eyed thinking about the
Yeah,
way that we
I
approach the
think that
world.
there are questions we just need to answer. I agree with you. I'm, it depends. Whether neoconservatism has been vindicated sort of depends on how you define neoconservatism,
Exactly.
or what ideas we're talking about. I think clearly the idea that we should take the world seriously and respond to threats, and to understand that if we don't respond to threats, the world will get worse. That's certainly been vindicated. Yet, the lessons are variable. I mean, just, now we have a lot of Democrats who are saying we're at war with Russia. They finally found a war that they like. At the same time, this administration, which is, I think, to some extent, as properly focused on trying to help Ukraine, if in kind of a very haphazard manner, as at the same time working assiduously to appease Iran, which is also linked to Russia, and in fact using Russians to help their campaign to appease Iran. There's a disconnect between that as well as their inability to form a coherent China policy, isn't there?
Oh, it's absolutely. Look, Joe Biden, for all of his reputation as being a foreign policy hand, his his foreign policy is is incredibly incoherent, and they are oftentimes, put in these difficult positions of, trying to say that you can't see what's right in front of your face. And I think, unfortunately, we're dealing with a lot of the junior varsity members of the Obama years,
Mm.
um, who, really
Who
are
have been
just
promoted to the varsity now.
exactly, who've been promoted well beyond their capabilities. And look, I want to have a foreign policy on the right that has more coherence to it, that balances more of the different perspectives involved. I don't think that you should have, one faction effectively running the show, which is, I think, the part of the problems that have happened in the past, particularly when it comes to being so wedded to certain decisions that you're unwilling to consider the viewpoints of people who might have disagreed with them. But but look, the what we're dealing with in terms of the Biden approach at this juncture, haphazard is the right word for it. They're throwing money at Ukraine, but they're not necessarily doing it in the ways that would be best, or procuring the material that Ukraine is saying that they really do need. And I think that just it's not it doesn't give me confidence about the direction of foreign policy in the future for the Democratic Party, considering that after Joe Biden, you don't exactly gain more coherence.
No.
The next leadership of the Democratic Party in the House and potentially in the Senate, it's not like they suddenly come in with having a more coherent foreign policy, or one that I think is going to be looking out for America's best interests. So, look, we're at a period of transition politically, and there's going to be a lot of new faces coming out of November, headed to Washington, with a a real lack, I would say, of clarity on the lessons that they've taken from the foreign policy and security decisions of the past couple of years. And you know, one thing that I do think is clear is that we have gotten the consequences of failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, in terms of the early goals that were set, have flowed into the presidency of Barack Obama, the presidency of Donald Trump, and now the presidency of Joe Biden, in ways that have not resulted in us having a clearer vision or a path forward. And that's not good. It's not good for the country. It's not good for our allies, and it's not good for the world.
Yeah, I think that's certainly very true. Let me just circle back for a moment. We talked about it a bit before about sort of this divide among conservatives. Certainly on foreign policy, it's produced almost as much incoherence on the right as there is on the left, where progressives they love Ukraine, but they don't really love America. So it's not clear what they'll stand up for in the future or who with. But conservatives are also divided. Between sort of we have the mainstream Washington establishment, which seems to be more despised than ever by the grassroots and many of the voters. Mitch McConnell's, who in some ways has done wonders for the Republicans on the judiciary and other issues, but he's also like the least, he's as unpopular as Joe Biden among Republicans. Um, what kind of, where's the future here? The we sort of have in the intellectual spheres we have these arguments between national conservatives, natcons, and sort of more traditional conservative thinkers, and people even further, as we've alluded to on the right. And yet we don't seem to know where they're all coming out with. Obviously, they're all reacting to Donald Trump, trying to be on the side of his voters. He's kind of broken. We haven't sorted that out yet, have we?
No, we haven't sorted it out. And my friend Dan McLaughlin likes to say, ideas don't run for president, people do.
Hmm.
And I think that's a big part of the reason that it hasn't been sorted out. Because look, to a certain extent, I think Donald Trump is kind of like it's like the blind man and the elephant. It's like you can grab onto different portions of what he represents
Mhm.
and make some kind of explanation, but he's still basically just a giant T-Rex. He just roams around the jungle, um, eating and sleeping and eating and sleeping. That's basically all he does. And I think that to me is one of the reasons it was so difficult to kind of define him, and he used it, I think, to great effect. But now in his post presidency, people are seizing on different aspects of this and trying to figure out a narrative when I don't think that that's necessarily something that is possible.
Mhm.
Um, because
Any more than it was possible while he was president, because
no,
even just if we were
no,
talking about foreign
it's
policy, while he sounded some sort of at times some neo-isolationist themes and gave people fodder to think he was against NATO, he was also promoting a very muscular policy in very many
totally,
ways on issues like Iran, strengthening ties with allies like Israel, and
hmm
actually getting NATO to pay up more.
yeah.
There's a contradiction there.
There's absolutely a contradiction, and it's I mean, I think that it was sort of if you stand back from it, it actually looks more like a return to a sort of Jacksonian foreign policy
Hmm.
in certain respects, um, which is something that's been very much a part of the right and very consistent, in ways over the years. I don't view Mike Pompeo's approach to foreign policy as at all, at odds with sort of the traditionalist um, sort of hawk right approach
Hmm.
to things. And that was very much the way that they approached foreign policy for the bulk of the presidency. But look, the thing that this divide that exists that you mentioned, the intellectual part of it is interesting, but the more practical part of it, I think, is less about the intellectual argument. What that interests me is less about the intellectual side of it and more about the priorities of this new generation of politicians, of which I would include, Ron DeSantis in that number. I would include J.D. Vance in that number. I would include Josh Hawley in that number. I would include, people like Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, who I think has a very bright future in that number. And they all have differences between them on different respects. They're not, all in the same place. But one thing that I think is definitely a noticeable shift is uh, overall a willingness to critique the corrupting nature of big business in ways that kind of the old school folks like McConnell find to be really disconcerting. And there's still very much of that. It's really unfair to call it a chamber mindset, but people would refer to it that way in DC, and that being pro business looks a certain way. But I think a lot of these other folks are uh, they're pro market in a lot of different ways, but they also are very skeptical of the warping nature of big business, and they're willing to take them on, or they're seeking out ways to take them on in ways that I never thought I'd see Republicans do, and that I think is a very positive development because the even if it's simply an attitude, a posture that says, you if you're going to be an American company, that you owe certain things to the country, and by way of having that definition. If you want to be a company that mostly serves the interests of China, then you're not going to necessarily get a pass on all of these different things. We're not going to necessarily be the types to take the first call from your lobbyists. We're not going to jump and do what you want us to say. And in a certain way, you can connect that all the way back to that first debate where Trump came out and basically said, all of these guys are corrupt. And I know that because I give them all money and they all take my phone call. And whether the Democrats or Republicans, they're all corrupt, etc. And that's something that I think Americans kind of knew prior to the great awakening of the corporate space, but they certainly know it now. and I mean, it's impossible to avoid, and normal people know it in a way that it used to be just sort of the politically engaged. And that to me is a very interesting development, and one that will flow into the nature of the policies that this incoming wave of Republicans are going to bring to bear. And I don't really know the ways that they're going to do it yet, but they're going to find ways to do it because it's just in their political interest to do it, and it's a signal to their supporters that yes, we're up against bureaucracies and teachers unions and all the normal sort of leftist bugaboos. But we don't like to see woke corporations push people around either. And we certainly don't like to see them embrace the sort of leftist indoctrination on identity. And we're going to find ways to push back against it. And that's going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, I think that is something to watch. One angle of that, and something I think both of us care a lot about, is speaking of woke corporations, sort of Silicon Valley and big tech and sort of the Silicon Valley oligarchs who have kind of put their fingers on the scale politically. And what is the response? What is going to be the response if there is a Republican majority next year? Are they going to do anything about it? I mean, you have firsthand experience of what happens when a company like Google decides to try to demonetize a publication, as they tried to do with the Federalist by forcing it to stop publishing comments. That's an issue on which sort of there's a lot of lip service paid, but and certainly there's a lot of resentment against sort of big tech and its obvious influence. But we've never had a situation before in our history. People talk about William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer and the media barons of the late 19th century and early 20th century, but they never dreamed of having the power that a handful of people in Palo Alto have now over, and basically they don't dominate the public square. They own the public square.
They own it. They are it. They define its strictures and its borders, what's acceptable, who's allowed in that public square, and what they're allowed to say there, and of course, who's allowed to listen. It's one of these things where just their power to engage in a silencing project of people sort of broadcasting without knowing that no one can actually find them, is immense. And I think, look, you're right to say that most of the response to this point has been lip service. I think what we should want, and we should have a clear idea about what we want. What we should want is for these companies to embrace the value system that ultimately led to their creation as a positive good, and not basically view their power as something that should be used to rend that apart. And that to me means having the mindset of an American company, which says we value free speech. We have we have certain values that go into the products that we create and how we believe they ought to be used. And that, I think, can take on a lot of uh, different solutions. Now, some people, on the right say just break them all up, and they basically, are adopting the Elizabeth Warren type, approach. Others say, tweak them on the edges when it comes to Section 230 reform, or when it comes to other things that are essentially, I would argue, acts of corporate welfare, because they basically say um, they put certain legal protections in place that are not afforded to other companies, and often in a very haphazard way, based on the fact that a lot of these rules were written before any of these companies existed or had any real power.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I think it's gonna be a process. I think that there are some smart people writing about it. I think Brendan Carr at the FCC in particular is someone who should be listened to more by people on the right. But one of the things that is definitely true is that these companies exercise far more power than I think any American can be comfortable with over the way that our discourse works. And when you see someone like Mark Zuckerberg put an enormous amount of money behind affecting the 2020 election, and doing it in a lot of ways that, while potentially legal, certainly raise, kind of the eyebrows of the approaches that are being used, drop boxes and the like.
Hmm.
And that to me is something that all has to be taken together here, because these companies are using their power in ways that make a lot of Americans, regardless of whether they have, regardless of whether they're on the list yet, they know that they could end up on the list, and they know that the barrier between not being on the list and being on the list can be, as the Babylon Bee found out, as simple as making the wrong joke, or the targeting the wrong person with a joke. Um,
Yeah, I think
and
that comes back to what we were talking about before about defending classical liberal values and sort of the inability of sometimes people on both ends of the spectrum to understand what they are or why they need to be defended.
Mhm. Absolutely, and I think that's why, that's a project that I think we have to undertake, and it has to primarily be undertaken by people who I think are not our elected politicians, but rather the writers and the people who are, having an impact on the way that our culture works. I know this is a funny point of comparison, but I was astounded by this podcast that was put out by the comedian Shane Gillis, primarily famous for being fired before he ever was on Saturday Night Live. He was hired by SNL. Then they found some of uh, his some jokes that he made about Chinatown or something on a podcast, and he got fired before he ever started. He did a podcast with Louis C.K. It's an epic length thing. It's like 6 hours plus, that you can find on YouTube, where they just were talking through um, the history of the American presidents, and they turn out to be both very well read, and most of the stories they tell are accurate. Not all of them, but most of them are accurate. But near the end, Louis goes on this little mini rant about uh, his views as a liberal and his frustrations with people not being able to live together and leave each other alone and tell jokes and say things that he believes are very important to the American project. And it was so funny for me to hear him say that, and obviously agree with him, but also feel like, we've reached a point where we aren't going to hear that kind of defense of free speech from the academy. We're not going to hear it from the civil liberties lawyers. We're not going to hear it from. We're going to hear it from these a liberal comedian, who can say the things that people in those positions aren't allowed to say anymore, because they've been cowed by the likes of the 1619 Project and the anti-racist baby and everything else that has gone into this identitarian movement on the left. And so the people who stand up and say it, who have some cultural influence, I think that we need to highlight that and build on that, and create the messaging and the storytelling around it to show people why this is so important.
Yeah, I think that's true. It comes down to defending our rights of free speech, of public discourse, of an open public discourse. And wherever you started on the political spectrum, I think one's attitudes toward that will ultimately define where we are as a country. Far more than whether you love Trump or hate Trump or what you think about Biden. I think these are sort of elemental defining questions about America.
Absolutely.
Anyway, Ben, I want to thank you so much for a really interesting conversation and for diving into a lot of these issues. We barely scratched the surface. Want to wish you good luck with your podcast and all your work on Fox News and elsewhere in your writing. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us on Facebook, the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV, please like and/or subscribe to Top Story and give us good reviews. Please let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.